"Open up, we have an HOA directive." The shout shattered the early morning stillness surrounding our cabin. Without hesitation, 3 men dressed in police uniforms burst through the front door. Their flashlights pierced the windows, beams cutting through the quiet like sirens. The sound of their boots pounding against the wooden floor echoed ominously, more threatening than authoritative. But their uniforms? Cheap knockoffs. Plastic badges hung awkwardly from thin shirts that looked like they were straight off a Halloween clearance rack. They thought my son would be easy to scare. What they didn't realize was this: Marcus wasn't just any guy. He was a former frontline operative who now trains people like them, a real officer, so how to stay alive in hostile scenarios. Within seconds, one impersonator was knocked out cold on the porch. Another was out cold near the kitchen. The last one, he was crying on the living room floor, begging for mercy. Susan Hayes, president of our homeowners association, thought she was running a simple community compliance sweep. Instead, she ended up at the center of a federal investigation. Her cleanup campaign had just opened a case file she didn't even know existed. You're watching Harper Story. Drop a comment with your location to keep up with the next twists. This week at the cabin was supposed to be peaceful. Just me, Ellis Ruhr, 58 years old and recently retired from software engineering, and my son, Marcus, catching up in the serene Colorado mountains. Pine Ridge Estates had always been our sanctuary, a place to disconnect. What I never anticipated was Susan Hayes turning that peaceful escape into a battlefield. She'd hired 3 goons to pretend to be law enforcement officers. Flashlights, fake uniforms, all bark and no bite. She expected us to roll over. Big mistake. The chaos kicked off while I was making coffee. The front door slammed open like a scene out of a bad action film. "Open up, we have an HOA directive." The leader was built like a linebacker, but his uniform screamed cheap and more costume than authority. His plastic badge jiggled as he moved, while one of his partners wore a shirt so wrinkled it looked like he slept in it. The third guy, twitchy and nervous, constantly glancing at his phone like he was waiting for instructions. They barged in like mall cops playing dress-up, their flashlights sweeping the room as if they were searching for evidence of some grand conspiracy. The big guy read from a crumpled piece of paper, announcing, "Marcus Ruhr, you're in violation of Pine Ridge Estates community regulations. Vacate the premises immediately." The irony hit me hard. These frauds were citing community standards while impersonating officers. Marcus walked in, calm as ever, wearing his FBI training shirt, bold letters right across his chest. The imposters didn't even notice. They were too focused on playing tough. That was their first mistake. What happened next looked like a live demonstration from a federal training video. Marcus didn't yell, he didn't posture, he simply took in the scene of the illegal entry, the counterfeit uniforms, the obvious intimidation, and responded with the precision of someone trained to handle far worse. The lead thug lunged, expecting to overpower Marcus. Instead, he was airborne, landing hard on the porch, completely unconscious. The second one tried to sneak in from the side but caught a quick combo that put him down in the kitchen, right next to my coffee pot. The third man, a nervous guy, saw the writing on the wall. He dropped to his knees, hands raised, tears running down his face. "Please, I didn't mean any harm. She only paid us $400 each. I just needed the rent money." But here's where things got interesting. Marcus hadn't just been working out on the back deck, he'd also been testing his personal drone surveillance system. It's a side project of his that automatically records and uploads footage when it detects suspicious movement. The entire confrontation had been filmed in crystal clear HD and uploaded in real time. What I didn't know then was that Marcus's system was wired into a higher level alert protocol. Once the drone recognized 3 armed intruders entering a home occupied by a federal trainer, it sent an automatic incident report straight to the appropriate authorities. Within half an hour, my phone buzzed. It was a call from the Colorado Federal Security Office. They'd received the alert. While we waited for law enforcement to arrive, I checked the downed intruders. The skinny Oni is still conscious. He kept trembling about how sorry he was, swearing this was his first time, insisting Susan Hayes promised it would just be a scare tactic. No violence. In the big guy's wallet, I found a wad of $1,200 in cash and a chilling handwritten note. "Bonus if you make them scared." ASH Marcus was already reporting the situation in his professional tone. 3 suspects restrained. Federal personnel residence. Immediate response team requested. He shot me a look I hadn't seen before, a mix of pride, caution, and something deeper I couldn't quite place. When the real officers and a couple of federal agents arrived, they swiftly took control. As the impersonators were taken away in cuffs, Marcus received messages on a phone I didn't recognize. His replies were short, coded, and official. When I asked, he simply said, "Work stuff, Dad, I'll explain later." But his eyes told me that later might be heavier than I was ready for. One of the agents, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, stepped toward me and handed over her card. "Mr. she said, "I'm Agent Chen. We'll need to talk. There's a good chance this goes deeper than it looks." Meanwhile, Susan Hayes was already firing up her social media accounts, completely unaware of the storm headed her way. She posted on Facebook like it was a victory parade. Mission accomplished. Troublemakers handled professionally. Community leadership. Justice served. A complete with a heavily filtered selfie taken in front of our cabin. She used one of those boss babe filters, grinning like she'd just won a prize instead of committed a felony. What Susan Hayes didn't realize was that she had just provided photographic evidence of her involvement in a conspiracy assault, forced entry, impersonating law enforcement. Her post was already being screen captured by investigators, who were moving with a speed I didn't think possible. As the final patrol car pulled away, carrying her hired muscle in cuffs, Marcus joined me on the steps of the cabin. The sun was finally cutting through the trees, casting long, thin shadows across what was now a federal crime scene. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, "I need to explain something about my job and why this whole incident probably isn't just a coincidence." He handed me his phone. On the screen was a secure-looking interface, full of case numbers, surveillance images, and an organizational card with Susan Hayes' face right in the middle. He showed me an automated alert that had been triggered the moment the drones detected a breach involving a federal trainer. That's when it hit me. Susan hadn't just staged some neighborhood intimidation stunt. She had unknowingly set off a federal investigation that night. What she thought was a simple enforcement of community standards had instead kicked off something far more serious. As I looked at my son, the gravity of the situation started to settle in. This was no longer a peaceful getaway. Our mountain retreat had just become ground zero for something far more dangerous. And then came the letter, 47 pages from the HOA, listing over 300 violations. I'd lived in Pine Ridge Estates for 15 years and had never even heard of most of these supposed infractions. The timing wasn't just suspicious, it was surgical. Every detail of that violation notice was crafted to apply directly to us. There were rules about dogs over 20 pounds. We didn't even own a dog. No vehicles older than 5 years, and my truck was 6. These weren't random codes, they were weapons. The more I looked into the HOA records, the more alarming it became. Susan Hayes had pushed through 73 rule changes in just the past 6 months. These weren't small clarifications, they were sweeping amendments that seemed perfectly designed to manufacture violations. One rule prohibited visible outdoor furniture after sunset. It went into effect 3 days after I'd bought new patio chairs. Another limited households to 2 vehicles. It passed the same week Marcus brought his motorcycle up for the summer. Each change was time-stamped, signed, and suspiciously approved by a board that, from what I could tell, was just Susan Hayes herself. Her signature was on everything. Then I uncovered something deeper, buried in county records, a shell company called Mountain Vista Holdings LLC. Through this front, Susan had been quietly trying to buy up properties in Pine Ridge Estates at prices well below market value. In the last 18 months, the company had made lowball offers to 23 families. Every single one of those families had received a barrage of HOA violations right before they were contacted. It was a clear pattern: invent violations, pressure homeowners to sell, and then scoop up the properties on the cheap. Ruthless, strategic, almost impressive if it weren't so malicious. That's when Agent Chen called again. Her tone was steady but carried a weight behind every word. "Mr. she said, "please continue with your normal routine. Don't confront Miss Hayes directly, and inform us immediately if there's any unusual HOA activity." I asked why the FBI would care about a homeowners association. She paused, then answered in a low, Careful voice. Let's just say Ms. Hayes has been on our radar for reasons that go far beyond Pine Ridge Estates. We need you to be our point of observation while maintaining your cover as a concerned resident. Later that day, while Marcus was running errands in town, I checked the mailbox and found a small manila envelope. No postage, no return address, just 6 words written in precise, looping handwriting. Read when no one is watching. We need to talk. Inside were a dozen photographs, each showing different families packing moving trucks, their faces full of defeat and fear. All of the photos were dated within the past 18 months, each one showing a family leaving Pine Ridge Estates. Attached to the photos was a handwritten list of 23 addresses of properties that had already been acquired by Mountain Vista Holdings. The message was unmistakable. Susan Hayes had been methodically forcing people out and acquiring their homes. The envelope was signed, DKA Dorothy Kessler. Dorothy was the sweet, 67-year-old neighbor who always baked cookies for new residents and organized the community potlucks. Apparently, she'd been paying a lot more attention to Susan's schemes than anyone gave her credit for. Her note ended with a phone number and a warning, call after dark. They watched during the day. At first, I thought that last part sounded paranoid, until Marcus came back from town. While testing his drone system around the perimeter of the property, he'd found 6 high-end surveillance cameras hidden in the trestle, none of which had been there when we arrived. These weren't cheap motion-activated units. They were professional grade, with live wireless transmission capabilities. Dad, Marcus said, showing me the drone footage, this is law enforcement level surveillance. Someone with serious funding is watching us. The implications were staggering. Susan Hayes wasn't just running a rogue HOA. She was operating something sophisticated enough to warrant covert observation and maybe even federal attention. That evening, I started digging into Susan's background. What I found explained far more than I expected. She'd once been a successful insurance agent in Denver. Broken bar. Susan Hayes hadn't always lived in Pine Ridge Estates. Before the 2008 financial collapse, she was a high-earning insurance executive, pulling in 6 figures and living in a luxury home just outside Denver. Then the recession hit. Her business crumbled, her assets vanished, and she filed for bankruptcy. She lost her house, her company, and perhaps more importantly, her trust in anyone having control over her life again. Since moving to Pine Ridge Estates 3 years ago, Susan had quietly and systematically removed anyone she saw as a threat to her authority. This wasn't just a woman hungry for control, it was someone deeply wounded by her past, so desperate to feel secure that she was willing to break the law to protect her new domain. To celebrate her latest victory, Susan created an elaborate PowerPoint titled Pine Ridge Perfect Community Vision 2025. It featured 47 slides filled with projections, cleanliness mandates, property value graphs, and rhetoric about undesirable element removal. She printed flyers, booked the community center, and even brought refreshments. The only attendees were herself, 2 overly groomed Persian cats, and a cactus, which she counted toward quorum. Marcus discovered the whole event had been live-streamed on the community's Facebook page. The video had 0 viewers, but while Susan was busy hosting her one-woman seminar, I was staring at the contents of Dorothy's anonymous package. 12 photos of frightened families packing moving trucks, a list of 23 homes all recently sold under distress to a shadowy LLC. We weren't her first targets. Susan had been refining this system for years, and Dorothy knew more about it than anyone would have guessed from her grandmotherly charm. As I stared at those images, a heavy realization settled in. This wasn't just about our family anymore. It was a fight for the soul of Pine Ridge Estates. The next morning, Agent Sarah Chen arrived at our cabin with a directive that shifted everything. Ellis, she said, we need you to help gather evidence. Marcus will train you in how to use the equipment. It hadn't occurred to me that my smartwatch could be transformed into a surveillance device, but that's exactly what it became. My personal wiretap, linked directly to the FBI. Chen was focused and sharp, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail, dressed in a black windbreaker that screamed federal agent even before you saw the badge. She spread photographs and maps across the kitchen table with the intensity of someone planning a tactical strike. This isn't just a fraudulent HOA, she explained, pointing to aerial drone shots of the neighborhood. "Susan Hayes is a small piece of a much larger machine. We need proof to bring the entire operation down." Marcus immediately kicked into professional mode. The easygoing son I'd gone hiking with days earlier was now a focused operative. He rolled out gear I'd only seen in spy movies: miniature audio recorders no bigger than a grain of rice, signal amplifiers capable of transmitting through concrete, and a drone that looked like military tech. He attached a tiny recording device to my smartwatch. "Anything she says within 10 feet of you will be captured and sent directly to Agent Chen's team," he said. "But you have to act natural. If she suspects anything, it's over." The weight of it all hit me. I wasn't just a resident anymore. I was officially embedded in a federal investigation. That night, I barely slept. The ethics gnawed at me. Was it right to record someone without their knowledge, even someone as clearly manipulative as Suzanne? What if we were wrong? Agent Chen seemed to anticipate the doubt. She sat across from me at the table with the quiet patience of someone who'd walked people through this before. "Ellis," she said, "Susan Hayes has used illegal HOA tactics to displace 47 families across 3 states. She's stolen over $2 million worth of property using fraud and fear. You're not spying on an overzealous neighbor, you're helping stop a criminal network." Still, it didn't sit right. And then, it got worse. Later that day, I met with Benjamin Cross, the local attorney I'd hired to fight the HOA citations. He seemed different. Nervous. Fidgety. His eyes darted toward his phone every few seconds, and his usual courtroom confidence had vanished. "Good news," he said, hands trembling as he rifled through paperwork. "Susan Hayes has agreed to dismiss all claims against your property. She's even prepared a written apology." It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a setup. The sudden change in tone, the too convenient piece of ring, it all felt rehearsed. While I sat in Benjamin's office, Marcus was deploying one of his most advanced surveillance tools, a nearly invisible microphone the size of a breadcrumb. He'd planted it outside Susan's HOA office, disguised so well it looked like lint on the windowsill. The audio it captured was chilling. Thinking her office was secure, Susan made a phone call. Her voice was smug, confident. "Benjamin's dealt with," she said. 15 grand was all it took to buy him off. "The roars will think they've won. Then we serve the forged court order tomorrow morning." She wasn't done. She laid out her entire plan on that calla how she had a fake court order prepped with Judge Miller's forged signature, ready to evict us within 48 hours. Then, with no emotion at all, she moved on to the next item on her list. The next 12 families she planned to liquidate. She spoke about those people, those homes, as if they were spreadsheet entries. Collateral, inventory. Susan spoke about the real estate scheme with the precision of someone who had stripped all humanity from the process of treating people like transactions, each one a calculated step toward profit. That evening, Marcus played me the audio he'd captured, and as her voice echoed from the speaker, a wave of nausea hit me. We'd come dangerously close to falling right into her trap. Agent Chen called not long after, her voice tight with urgency. "Ellis," she said, "we've been tracking Susan Hayes for 8 months as part of a broader federal operation, a code name, Operation Clean Sweep. It's a nationwide effort targeting fraudulent HOA networks. And the intel you gathered today, that's what we needed to proceed with arrests." Everything shifted in that moment. Our peaceful mountain retreat wasn't just a vacation spot anymore. It had become the epicenter of a multi-state investigation into organized real estate fraud. Chen laid it out clearly. "Tomorrow morning, Susan will make her move. Be ready." My emotions were all over the place. Relief that there was finally a path toward justice. Anger that Benjamin Cross, our local lawyer, had betrayed us. And a creeping realization that we were entangled in something far bigger than a petty neighborhood power struggle. I couldn't stop asking myself, how many others were involved? How deep did this go? Marcus saw the look in my eyes. He rested a steady hand on my shoulder, speaking with the calm resolve of someone who'd faced impossible odds before. "Dad, the good guys are going to win, but we have to let her believe she already has." Meanwhile, Susan Hayes was basking in what she believed was her triumph. She live-streamed on TikTok with the title "Community Leader Defeats Troublemaker," a victory lap for her dozen followers. But in her rush to gloat, she forgot to turn off her mic. "And Judge Miller signed off on night just like we planned," she bragged, thinking the stream had ended. In 48 hours, the roars will be gone, just like the others. Unwittingly, she had just handed law enforcement a confina-live-in timestamped. Later, Marcus played me a separate recording that detailed what Susan called Phase 2, Pine Ridge Total Sweep. Her objective? To remove the remaining 47 families she considered obstacles within 6 months. This wasn't just about us, it was about systematically wiping out anyone who didn't fit her vision for the community. Agent Chen's reaction confirmed what I feared. The FBI had long suspected this timeline, but until now, they lacked the evidence to act. That night, there was a knock at our back door. Standing there, briefcase in hand, was someone I never expected. Dorothy Kessler. "Ellis," she said, "I'm retired Judge Dorothy Kessler. I've been orchestrating this investigation for 8 months." The sweet, cookie-baking neighborhood welcomed every newcomer with warmth was gone. In her place stood a seasoned federal judge with 3 decades of experience dismantling organized crime. Her demeanor had changed, imperially sharp, authoritative, and focused. She placed her worn leather briefcase on our kitchen table and flipped it open, revealing a stack of files more fitting for a prosecutor's war room than a retiree's kitchen. In that instant, everything about Pine Ridge Estates came into focus. Dorothy hadn't just been collecting evidence. She had engineered an entire sting operation with the skill of someone who had spent a career locking up criminal enterprises. "I moved to Pine Ridge specifically to investigate Susan," she said, laying out surveillance photos and case files. "The FBI brought me out of retirement when they realized how deeply embedded this scheme was. They needed someone who knew how to untangle real estate fraud at scale." Her documents included everything: financial records, surveillance logs, organizational charts. Dorothy had pieced together the full scope of Susan's operation. She had even built a network of 23 FMLISA residents who'd been targeted by HOA violations and forced into silence. With her guidance, they'd quietly gathered evidence, recorded harassment, and logged every instance of misconduct. "We call ourselves the Pine Ridge Patriots," she said with a faint smile. "Susan thinks she's been picking off families one by one. She has no idea we've been coordinating from day one." The organization was staggering. Spreadsheets tracked rule changes and vote records. Dozens of sworn affidavits detailed illegal actions. Secret recordings documented private conversations. The Patriots had created a case that any U.S. attorney would be eager to prosecute. Dorothy then handed me a binder labeled Operation Clean Sweep. It contained internal FBI documents outlining the larger picture: a criminal network stretching across 15 states, using HOAs as a front to extort and displace homeowners. The strategy was disturbingly effective: invent violations, apply pressure, force sales, and resell the properties through shell companies at full market value. Over $12 million in profits had been funneled through this system. Susan Hayes wasn't just a rogue HOA president. She was a key player in a complex, well-funded enterprise designed to exploit housing law for profit. Dorothy's role: she was acting as a field coordinator for witness protection, tasked with keeping vulnerable residents safe while gathering airtight evidence. Meanwhile, Marcus had uncovered something even more damning. He linked Susan Hayes to 18 additional HOAs operating under the Mountain Vista Holdings LLC umbrella. Each followed the same pattern: abrupt rule changes, legal intimidation, and forced relocations. The only difference was location. What made Susan uniquely dangerous was her background. With her knowledge of insurance law and legal gray areas, she had navigated just under the radar of local enforcement for years. But this was now a federal matter. That evening, we held a clandestine meeting in our garage. Dorothy led the briefing. 31 residents showed up, each with a specific role to play in what she called the final phase of the operation. Some residents were tasked with monitoring Susan's movements. Others were trained to discreetly record conversations, while a select few had received instruction in legal protocols to ensure every piece of evidence would stand up in a federal courtroom. The level of organization was astounding. It felt more like a military operation than a neighborhood meeting. Dorothy, calm and focused, handed out assignments, reviewed procedures, and reminded everyone just how critical this moment was for Pine Ridge Estates. Her strategy was both elegant and strategic: set a trap using information flow to push Susan into exposing her entire operation voluntarily, By managing the discussion and creating pressure points during the public home meeting, they aimed to prompt Susan into defending her actions with so much detail. She'd inadvertently reveal her criminal network, her collaborators, and her future plans. Her ego is her vulnerability, Dorothy explained. She can't help but boast, especially when she believes she's already won. All we have to do is give her a stage and let her do the rest. Meanwhile, Marcus was battling with guilt. He confided in me during a quiet moment on their back deck, the evening air heavy with anticipation. "Dad," he said, voice tight, "you're here because of me, because of my job, because I brought you into this. If something happens to you," a broken bar. He couldn't finish the sentence, but I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. The man who trained federal agents was afraid not for himself but for his father. Susan, ever eager to cement her status, had organized what she called a professional support team for the upcoming home meeting. 12 hired individuals meant to clap, smile, and nod enthusiastically. What she didn't realize was that she'd accidentally contracted a ballet company rehearsing Swan Lake at the community center. The meeting turned into something surreal. 12 dancers in white tutus clapped in perfect unison, perfectly synchronized to Tchaikovsky's score. Even Dorothy couldn't suppress a laugh when Susan, oblivious to the absurdity, thanked her loyal supporters for their graceful show of appreciation. Later that night, Dorothy handed me a new file, Operation Clean Sweep, a final phase. The first page listed 127 fraudulent HOAs operating nationwide. Susan Hayes' name was at the top, marked Target Alpha, Kingpin level. In that moment, it hit me, this wasn't about a petty community power grab. We were about to bring down the mastermind of the largest HOA-based real estate scam in the country. The woman who had masqueraded as an overly ambitious community leader was, in fact, the CEO of a sprawling criminal enterprise. Her schemes had displaced hundreds of families and siphoned millions of dollars from unsuspecting homeowners, all under the guise of community management. Then came a moment I'll never forget. Agent Chen looked me in the eye and rested her hand on my shoulder. Her expression was solemn, almost reverent. "Ellis," she said, "Susan Hayes isn't just an HOA president. She's the head of a $127 million real estate fraud empire. And you're the final key to unlocking it all." Morning sunlight streamed through our kitchen windows as Chen spread out aerial photos on the table. Red dots marked sites across 18 states, each one linked to a fake HOA tied to the operation. What I had once believed was a neighborly dispute was, in fact, the epicenter of the most extensive real estate scam in U.S. history. The numbers were staggering: 127 shell HOAs, over 3,400 families victimized, and a criminal system so advanced it had stayed hidden for more than 3 years. Susan's empire wasn't just large, it was genius in its design, a masterclass in exploiting legal gray areas and psychological tactics. Chen walked me through their methodology with cold precision. First, they'd identify communities with minimal or weak HOA oversight. Then, operatives like Susan would embed themselves and gradually assume leadership. Once in control, they'd begin rewriting community rules to manufacture violations. Their targets? Homeowners who were financially strained, elderly, or socially isolated, those least likely to fight back. The psychological pressure was expertly calibrated. Just enough legal intimidation to scare families into selling, but subtle enough to avoid drawing official attention. No overt threats, only fines, hearings, and endless bureaucracy. Financially, the structure was as efficient as it was predatory. With a web of shell companies and compliant local officials, they created a system that yielded up to 400% profit per property. Families were cornered into selling at 60–70% of market value to escape legal chaos, and those same homes were flipped at full price through seemingly legitimate channels. On paper, everything looked voluntary. The rule changes had been voted on, the sales were willing, and the families, just moving out. It was all smoke and mirrors, but airtight enough to avoid prosecution. My role in the final phase of Operation Clean Sweep came with a moral weight that had kept me awake the night before. Agent Chen needed me to confront Susan directly, wearing covert recording gear to capture a full confession, ideally one that would expose not just her actions here, but her leadership role in the entire criminal network. This mission wasn't just about collecting a final piece of evidence. It meant putting myself in harm's way so that thousands of others wouldn't have to endure what we had barely survived. The risk wasn't lost on me, nor was the possibility that involving Marcus further could place him in even greater danger. The realization that I had willingly stepped into the crosshairs of a criminal syndicate made my stomach tighten with dread. What kind of father chooses to become the target of a dangerous organization, even if it's in the name of justice? Sensing my turmoil, Marcus quietly joined me on the front steps of the cabin. His eyes held the weight of someone who had witnessed firsthand the devastation people like Susan Hayes could cause. "Dad," he said softly, "I've spent the last 3 years preparing agents for situations just like this. I know the procedures, the risks and how to keep you protected. But more importantly, I've seen what happens to neighborhoods when people like Susan are left unchecked." His voice carried the unwavering resolve of someone whose life work had been dedicated to shielding the innocent from organized corruption. Still, I could see the unease behind his steady gaze. He wasn't just an agent now, he was a son watching his father walk straight into danger. As we combed through Agent Chen's files, the true depth of Susan's influence became shockingly clear. Her criminal network wasn't just sophisticated, it was embedded in the very structures meant to uphold the law. 23 public officials were implicated, from judges who signed off on fraudulent evictions to city council members greenlighting shady zoning changes. There were inspectors creating violations on demand and lawyers crafting legal loopholes for actions that were, by all other standards, criminal. Judge Milra, who authorized our eviction, was merely one cog in a massive machinery of bribery and abuse that spanned from Colorado to Florida. The plan that Dorothy and Agent Chen had developed was both brilliant and unnerving in its simplicity. I was to confront Susan face to face at our cabin, outfitted with high-tech recording gear, while Marcus and a dozen federal agents concealed themselves in the nearby woods. 40 residents would be present, applying the social pressure needed to make Susan expose her entire scheme. It all hinged on timing, precision, and a level of trust in the system I wasn't sure I still had, especially after learning just how long we had been monitored. My emotions were a tangled mess of fury at being manipulated, fear for my family's safety, determination to bring Susan down, and a deep sense of betrayal over how much had been kept from me. It was unsettling to realize our peaceful mountain home had been chosen as the final stage for a sprawling federal operation. How long had we been under surveillance? How many of our neighbors were undercover agents or informants? How much of what we'd lived had been authentic, and how much orchestrated? While we prepared, Susan was busy basking in what she thought was her ultimate success. She live-streamed on LinkedIn, bragging to an audience of over 1,200 about her innovative real estate model. With stunning arrogance, she casually outlined the very methods being investigated by the FBI, even naming the 18 states where her scheme was active. Her figures matched federal data almost exactly. The comment section quickly filled with skeptical questions about the legality of her tactics, but Susan, blinded by her own self-importance, missed every red flag. Her closing statement was the final nail in her own coffin. Some call it aggressive community management, I call it the evolution of property ownership in America. Dorothy later showed me a GPS-marked map that pinpointed the 23 compromised officials and revealed the countdown to D-Dia. Operation Pine Ridge final sweep was set to begin in just 18 hours. That's when it became painfully clear. Susan wasn't just planning to cement her control over Pine Ridge. She was preparing to erase all traces of her crimes by systematically removing every resident who could testify against her. This wasn't just about our family anymore. We had become the last defense for an entire neighborhood that had no idea it was on the brink of being erased. In the end, Susan Hayes made the gravest mistake of her criminal career. She chose to confront a family whose son trains federal agents, whose father was wired for evidence, whose next-door neighbor turned out to be a retired federal judge coordinating the sting, and whose community had already united against her. As night fell over Pine Ridge Estates, tension crackled in the air. Federal agents took up hidden positions in the forest. Dorothy's team positioned cameras around the property, and I ran one final check on the recording device embedded in my jacket. What was about to happen would either dismantle Susan's empire for good or cost us everything we had worked for. At precisely 8 p.m., Susan arrived at the cabin flanked by 14 armed enforcers. It was a stark display of power meant to intimidate anyone who might oppose her. Unlike her earlier theatrics with fake cops, these men carried real tactical gear, blinding flashlights, and weapons that left no doubt as Susan had escalated from manipulation to open threats of violence. The transformation was chilling. The woman who once portrayed herself as a concerned HOA president now stood revealed as the ruthless leader of a criminal organization, willing to go to deadly lengths to protect her interests. Her voice, amplified by a bullhorn, echoed with icy finality. "Ellis, you and your son have 48 hours to leave Pine Ridge Estates permanently. There will be no second warning." Her men moved with military precision, surrounding the cabin and installing floodlights that turned our peaceful sanctuary into something out of a war zone. The message was unmistakable: total submission or face consequences far more severe than fines and legal notices. Just as Agent Chen predicted, the situation escalated when it became clear we weren't backing down. Susan's calm cracked, her voice laced with venom. "You people never learn?" she snapped, signaling her enforcers to close in on the cabin where 40 residents were waiting, ready to expose her for the criminal she truly was. "Sometimes," she said coldly, "cleaning up a community requires permanent solutions." The mask was gone. This was no longer about community rules or property lines. It was about power and what Susan Hayes was willing to do to keep it. This wasn't about property disputes anymore. It had become a mission to silence anyone capable of exposing Susan's empire, regardless of the human toll. Marcus sprang into action with the efficiency of someone who had trained others for scenarios just like this. When Susan's men surged toward the front door, hoping to overpower us through brute force, they were met with a level of preparedness and strategy they hadn't anticipated. The first intruder was lifted off his feet and slammed unconscious onto the porch exactly as I had seen during our run-in with the fake cops. A second man tried sneaking in through the kitchen, aiming to ambush Marcus from the side, but within seconds he was sprawled beside my coffee maker, taken down by a blur of precise movement too fast for my eyes to follow. The third assailant didn't even try. One look at his incapacitated comrades and he dropped to his knees, hands in the air, pleading just like that imposter officer from the first day. Then came the full force of justice. From the surrounding trees, 18 FBI agents emerged in flawless coordination, surrounding the remaining intruders like phantoms closing in. Their movements reflected weeks of intense planning and synchronization. Dorothy's team had mounted cameras capturing the entire ordeal from multiple vantage points of 6 angles in total, ensuring the irrefutable documentation of Susan's intent to use deadly force against ordinary families. Susan, the architect of a vast criminal operation built on legal loopholes and psychological pressure, found herself completely outmaneuvered by experts who'd studied her every tactic. In one final desperate act, she grabbed me and pulled a pistol, holding it to my head in a last-ditch attempt to bargain her way out. Backed against the kitchen wall, she shouted wildly at the federal agents closing in. "You don't know who you are dealing with," she screamed. "I have judges in 12 states, local officials in over 40 cities, and enough dirt on Congress to shut down half of Washington. My group pulls in over $10 million a year through fully legal community improvement initiatives." She ranted on, unaware that every word was being recorded by the hidden mic in my smartwatch audio that captured her manic confession in stunning detail. She named corrupt officials, outlined financial channels, explained legal manipulation strategies, everything Agent Chen had been chasing for over 2 years. In her panic, she handed prosecutors a complete blueprint of her operation, something that would have taken investigators years to assemble through traditional surveillance. Then Dorothy stepped through the front door, her presence calm and unwavering despite the weapon aimed at my head. Her voice was clear and commanding, the voice of a woman who'd once overseen federal courts. "Susan," she said, "I'm retired federal judge Dorothy Kessler. You're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of government officials, and conspiracy to commit murder." The expression on Susan's face at that moment when she realized the kindly neighbor organizing community potlucks had orchestrated her takedown was almost worth the preceding terror. That's when the full picture came into focus. Agent Chen explained that our cabin had been chosen as the final trap in a 2-year-long federal investigation targeting HOA fraud rings across the nation. Marcus and I hadn't just stumbled into the conflict, we were handpicked. I was the bait, chosen precisely because of Marcus's FBI background and my vulnerability as a seemingly unassuming single father. The realization hit hard. I was both manipulated and instrumental in unraveling one of the largest real estate frauds in U.S. history. Even while being cuffed and read her rights, Susan couldn't let go of her bravado. She went live on Instagram using a strong woman filter and captioned the stream, "Temporarily detained by a corrupt system, #entrepreneur life #never surrender #boss woman." 47 viewers watched her meltdown as she shrieked about conspiracies, demanding to speak to senators who were on her payroll. Her detachment from reality was nearly as astonishing as the empire she'd built. Agent Chen handed me a thick folder labeled Operation Clean Sweep, National Impact Report at 340 pages detailing the investigation. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Pine Ridge or even Susan Hayes. It was about 3,400 families in 18 states whose lives had been upended by a criminal enterprise posing as a homeowners association. A year later, I stood watching Marcus lead free martial arts classes for 127 Childrena kids from families Susan had targeted. Dorothy had launched the Justice Center, offering legal and emotional support to victims across the country. The transformation of Pine Ridge Estates was staggering. What had once been a neighborhood cloaked in fear was now a model of openness and collaboration. What started as a desperate attempt to save our family cabin evolved into a nationwide shift in how HOAs operated. Even months after Susan's arrest, the ripple effects of Operation Clean Sweep continued spreading. Pine Ridge now operated under a completely restructured HOA. Thanks to Dorothy's decades of judicial experience, rule changes now required majority resident approval. Financial records were released quarterly online, and a civilian oversight committee made sure no one could ever consolidate the kind of power Susan once had. The 3,400 defrauded families received a total of $184 million in restitution money recovered from seized assets and prosecutions of every corrupt official involved. As for me, retirement had taken a surprising turn. I now worked as an FBI consultant on HOA fraud cases, helping uncover 73 similar schemes across the country on the condition that I'd never again be kept in the dark during an investigation. The emotional toll of being used as unknowing bait had required months of therapy, but it had also given me a unique lens into how these organizations operate and how to stop them. Helping other families recognize the early signs of home manipulation became more fulfilling than anything I'd done in my old software career. The legal system responded swiftly and decisively to Susan's crimes. She was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, and for the first time in years, Pine Ridge Estates and thousands of families just like ours could finally breathe free. Susan Hayes received a 45-year federal sentence, with no chance of parole, and was forced to surrender all $31 million in assets. The 23 public officials who had enabled her scheme faced prison terms ranging from 8 to 25 years, each permanently banned from holding any form of public office. The entire corrupt HOA empire was dismantled. A total of 127 fraudulent homeowner associations were shut down and restructured under federal supervision. But the most significant outcome was the passing of the HOA Reform Act of 2026. This landmark legislation established mandatory financial transparency and democratic controls for all homeowner associations nationwide. Marcus was promoted to Senior Community Crime Specialist for the FBI. He quickly became the agency's foremost expert in community-based fraud, leading training programs across the country and spearheading new initiatives to combat similar schemes. His critical role in both protecting our family and building the federal case brought him national recognition, making him one of the youngest leaders ever to head a multi-state task force. Though he'd once struggled with guilt for dragging me into danger, that burden eventually turned into a deep sense of purpose. Together, we hadn't just stopped one corrupt leader, we'd helped bring down a widespread criminal network that had devastated hundreds of lives. Our journey toward healing wasn't instant. It took 8 months of counseling to work through the emotional fallout, both from being manipulated by law enforcement and targeted by organized crime. Learning how much had been kept from us strained our trust, but in time, it deepened our understanding of each other. The therapy helped Marcus and me rebuild communication and trust on stronger, more honest foundations. Even Dorothy joined us in those sessions. Coming to terms with her double life and her role in orchestrating our involvement was difficult. But her willingness to be part of our healing made it easier to accept the depth of her motivations. The transformation of Pine Ridge Estates became a national model. Our annual Pine Ridge Freedom Day Festival now attracts thousands who come to learn about homeowners' rights, community organizing, and holding local leadership accountable. The cabin where it all began is now a national symbol. A bronze plaque at the entrance reads, "Where the fight against HOA tyranny began." 2025. Dorothy's Justice Center has since provided free legal assistance to over 1,200 families facing abuse and harassment from their HOAs. Its mission to restore fairness and accountability has become a beacon of hope across the country. The impact of our case reached far beyond our neighborhood. The HOA Reform Act redefined how community associations are run in the United States. It mandated open financial records, democratic rule changes, and federal oversight for any HOA with more than 50 homes. Marcus now serves as Deputy Director of the FBI's newly formed HOA Crimes Unit, which investigates fraud and corruption in community associations nationwide. The 3,400 families harmed by Susan's organization united to form a national support group. They now help other communities recognize warning signs, share resources, and prevent similar scams from taking root. The legacy of our struggle wasn't one of revenge or lone heroism. It was about collective resilience and the incredible power of communities coming together. We learned that real trust isn't demanded, it's built, earned through honesty and shared purpose. When people align their efforts with transparency and mutual respect, no criminal operation, and no matter how well hidden, it can last forever. Personally, I came away from the experience with a clarity and peace I hadn't known before. My anger over being used by the FBI gave way to an appreciation for the impossible choices they'd faced. The fear I once carried for my family was replaced with confidence that we'd learned to face threats as a team. And the loneliness I felt after retirement disappeared into a new mission, helping others escape what we once endured. Marcus had grown into a leader who knew how to balance duty with empathy. He learned that protecting those you love isn't about keeping them in the dark, it's about sharing the truth and carrying the load together. The guilt he once bore turned into wisdom that now protects families across the country. And as for Suzanne, word from federal prison is that she tried to launch a prison HOA complete with premium cell upgrades and gourmet meal plans for a fee. She named herself president. Naturally, she's now in solitary confinement for violating internal community standards. Even behind bars, Susan Hayes couldn't resist the urge to dominate and profit off those around her. Just yesterday, I received 23 emails from families all across the country. Each one echoed the same sentiment. Ellis, we think our HOA is pulling a Susan Hayes, but this time, we know what to do: organize, document, contact the FBI, and never stay silent. I smiled as I watched Marcus pack his gear for yet another consultation trip. The lessons from Pine Ridge had started a movement, a quiet revolution that's changing America, one neighborhood at a time. Have you ever felt powerless against unreasonable HOA rules? Felt alone in the face of community bullying? At HOA Stories, we know that feeling, and every story we tell is a reminder that you're not alone. We're here to speak up, stand with you, and fight for justice in neighborhoods where it feels out of reach. Don't forget to like and subscribe to HOA Stories, where you'll never miss the next thrilling chapter. And if your HOA ever find you for your grass height, we're here to turn that frustration into hope and a little bit of laughter. Subscribe for more tales of community chaos, justice with a twist, and a reminder that even the most absurd battles can spark real change.